The purpose of this video is to give an introductory run through to the ALM module that exists within PFaroe. Firstly, when we enter into the ALM module, the first task is to select the date, scheme if applicable, and basis for which we want to run the ALM on by clicking OK at the top here. Within the ALM tool, we have two main asset liability models that we can run, deterministic and stochastic. And I'm going to start by running through the stochastic element by clicking stochastic here and clicking run. This is going to show us the outcomes of the stochastic simulations that are run over the time period of the ALM, so that's 10 or 20 years. We're running 2,000 stochastic scenarios for each ALM year from evaluation date into the future. And on the left-hand side here, we're going to run through the various tabs that we have for the initial results. So on the funding level tab, we can see the funnel of certainty or uncertainty, as it were, for the different percentiles that are shown. And we can click these on and off on the graph. I should mention we can always toggle to a table view, and also we have an Excel download button that will allow us to download our results that we've run. Alongside the funding level view, we can also look at the assets in isolation, the liability distributions in isolation, and also the distribution of liability discount rates year on year. The net position simply shows the distribution of surplus and deficits. And we have a contributions tab, which will give some interesting stochastic output that we'll come back to depending on the contribution strategy that we select. On the returns tab, we can look at cumulative nominal returns for the assets. The reason that this funnel is decreasing inside is these are actually annualized returns, or we can look at an annual nominal return distribution. Down the bottom here, we can navigate between different scenarios, which we'll come back to, and we can also select from our sample percentiles to see the results at some selected time steps of the tab we're currently clicked in. So here we're looking at the 50th percentile funding level for the 30th of September 17, 2019 and 2026. We'll now give a brief run through of the elements that can be amended within the ALM inputs and then the ALM stochastic ALM rerun. Firstly is the asset strategy type, and we have 5 main asset strategy types that can be applied. Firstly, constant allocation. Within here, we are simply putting in a percentage for each asset class that we wish to be invested in. And at the end of each time period in the ALM, these percentages will be kept constant regardless of asset performance. And that is achieved by rebalancing at the end of each time period to make sure that these percentages are constant. Here it's worth noting that the traditional functionality applies for picking the funds that you wish to allocate into. So we've got the funds picker here where you can pick from our UK proxy funds, individual gilts, and if applicable, your own area. We've also got the ability to open up an allocation that you've saved elsewhere in allocations module or in other what if modules. And we've also got the ability to save the allocation that you've created and to toggle between pound amounts and percentage amounts. Nominal allocation is lesser used, but allows the user to select one particular asset class to use as a balancing fund. So this means that any returns over each time period will be reinvested into this one selected asset class. In nominal terms, all of the other asset classes will be kept constant. We can also perform an annual allocation, so we can click to extend or collapse our parameters in the top right here for our inputs. And for each of our asset classes, we can select the percentages that we wish to allocate into those asset classes year on year throughout the ALM. Just a point to note here is that if we were to amend one of these elements, we then have an unbalanced. We can always rebalance by clicking any one of the other asset classes to get us to 100%. If we wish to maintain that as constant throughout time, we can click the fast forward button. That will copy this row to all the remaining rows in the sheet. Alternatively, we also have a paste from Excel function, which allows you to paste in the entire asset allocations for each and every year. In order to use this, you'll simply need to construct in Excel a table or a range of cells that contains exactly the same number of asset classes shown here and the same number of years, and that can then be pasted in from Excel. Moving on, the buy and hold strategy relates to inputting nominal amounts in each asset class that will then be held without any rebalancing adjustment. So any returns that are attributable to each asset class will be reinvested into that particular asset class. Lastly, the funding level trigger parameter functionality allows us to select various allocations to then be amended if the scheme hits certain trigger levels. So, for example, we could select our current asset allocation for a funding level of less than 80% and a further asset allocation, a differing asset allocation for the scenarios where the funding level hits more than 80%. By clicking above or below, we can then construct further funding level scenarios. Please note that to construct these, we go down the page in increasing funding levels, so we'll get a warning message if we were to put a lower number. This would be a higher number here and a lower number here, and then we could select our further allocations, for example, for under 78% funded, for over 82% funded, and so on and so forth. We also have a de-risking only flag here. What this relates to is whether if in our scenario we get above 80% funded and move to a gilts matched asset allocation, if we then go below 80% funded again, will we go back to the previous allocation or will we stick in the gilts matched? If we click de-risking only, we will stick in the gilts matched allocation, whereas if we click that off, we would go back to the previous asset allocation if the funding level dropped back below 80%. So those describe the 5 different strategy types. Next up, we also have return shifts that we can apply to any one of our asset classes in any one of the ALM years. What any changes will do here is apply an increase or decrease to the returns for each of these asset classes in percentage terms for any one of the time periods shown, and we can also use the paste from Excel functionality here. Please note that if we increase, for example, the returns in a particular year, or indeed to copy them throughout the ALM model, we are not varying anything stochastically here. This simply means that the global equity return in every scenario throughout the ALM will be 0.5% higher than the ALM that we originally ran. Next up, the contribution strategy allows us to insert either a defined or calculated contribution strategy. For a defined contribution strategy, we can either input an upfront contribution or any one of deficit or employer contribution strategy. These amounts here will be pre-populated from a payment schedule if it's been completed with respect to future contributions. In a calculated contribution strategy, We then have the ability to select valuation years in which we're then going to calculate a contribution based on a recovery period number and an asset outperformance number. By running this, we're then going to see a stochastic contributions outcome that will result from each of those valuation years selected. And we then see our funding level building towards 100%. If we were then to see the total contributions, we can then see that in each valuation year, so 2019, 2022, and 2025, the contribution amounts vary stochastically because they've been calculated dependent on the funding level at that time and the calculation of a recovery plan over that time. Lastly, in terms of functionality, we also have the ability to enter fixed expenses year on year. It's worth noting that when we run several scenarios down the page here, we've got a couple of facets that allows us to compare on the graph. We can pin a scenario and then select another scenario to compare them on the same graph. Alternatively, we can fix the axis so that we can compare the two more easily as well. It is also possible to click on a particular time period so that we can then see, so this is time T5 for example, we can then see the different percentiles across our different scenarios and compare them. And again, we can click scenarios on and off for our graphical content, and we can navigate throughout time again to give a different slice of the different scenarios for a particular time period that's shown up here as well. Secondly, our deterministic ALM, by contrast, simply runs one particular asset liability modeling based on some detailed parameters that we'll go through now. So this is just running one point scenario for both the assets and liabilities. The strategy types have the same choices, but then we have a couple of extra elements here given that we're simply running one scenario. We then have a lot of control over that particular one scenario. Starting with our risk factors, these correspond to all the non-fixed income asset classes, and in these risk factors you can directly alter the deterministic returns year on year, and each of the components in play are shown in this table. We can alter our liability projection methodology. We can also explicitly alter our realized conditions within the ALM within deterministic. So this relates to the cash returns and inflation returns year on year. By contrast to our risk factors, we can also then apply yield shifts to our underlying curves that impact on the asset classes that aren't determined by risk factors. These include interest rates and inflation, the interest rate spread on liabilities, and credit spreads on non-government and government bonds. We have the same contribution strategy and expense inputs in the deterministic area as well. That concludes our general run through of the PFaroe ALM functionality. If you have any questions arising from the use of ALM, please contact us at support@riskfirst.com. Thank you.